He was unsure as to what to do next, since he knew that what he had understood was so profound that it would be difficult for others to fathom. The god Brahma descended from his heaven and asked him to teach, pointing out that humans are at different levels of development, and some of them would benefit from his teaching. Consequently, the Buddha concluded that the most suitable students would be his first teachers of meditation, but he was informed by a deity that they had died. He thought next of his 5 former comrades in the practice of asceticism. The Buddha determined through his clairvoyance that they were residing in a deer park in Sarnath, outside Varanasi, Benares. He set out on foot, meeting along the way a wandering ascetic with whom he exchanged greetings. When he explained to the man that he was enlightened and so was unsurpassed even by the gods, the man responded with indifference. Although the 5 ascetics had agreed to ignore the Buddha because he had given up self-mortification, they were compelled by his charisma to rise and greet him. They asked the Buddha what he had understood since they left him. He responded by teaching them, or, in the language of the tradition, he set the wheel of the Dharma in motion. Dharma has a wide range of meanings, but here it refers to the doctrine or teaching of the Buddhas. In his first sermon, the Buddha spoke of the middle way between the extremes of self-indulgence and self-mortification and described both as fruitless. He next turned to what have come to be known as the 4 Noble Truths, perhaps more accurately rendered as 4 Truths for the spiritually noble. As elaborated more fully in other discourses, the first is the truth of suffering, which holds that existence in all the realms of rebirth is characterized by suffering. The sufferings particular to humans are birth, aging, sickness, death, losing friends, encountering enemies, not finding what one wants, finding what one does not want. The second truth identifies the cause of this suffering as non-virtue, negative deeds of body, speech, and mind that produce the karma that fructifies in the future as physical and mental pain. These deeds are motivated by negative mental states, called klesha, afflictions, which include desire, hatred, and ignorance, the false belief that there is a permanent and autonomous self amidst the impermanent constituents of mind and body. The third truth is the truth of cessation, the postulation of a state beyond suffering, called nirvana. If the ignorance that motivates desire and hatred can be eliminated, negative deeds will not be performed and future suffering will not be produced. Although such reasoning would allow for the prevention of future negative deeds, it does not seem to account for the vast store of negative karma accumulated in previous lifetimes that is yet to bear fruit. However, the insight into the absence of self, when cultivated at a high level of concentration, is said to be so powerful that it also destroys all seeds for future lifetimes. Cessation entails the realization of both the destruction of the causes of suffering and the impossibility of future suffering. The presence of such a state, however, remains hypothetical without a method for attaining it, and the fourth truth, the path, is that method. The path was delineated in a number of ways, often as the 3 trainings in ethics, meditation, and wisdom. In his first sermon, the Buddha described the 8-fold path of correct view, correct attitude, correct speech, correct action, correct livelihood, correct effort, correct mindfulness, and correct meditation. A few days after the first sermon, the Buddha set forth the doctrine of no self, anatman, at which point the 5 ascetics became arhats, those who have achieved liberation from rebirth and will enter nirvana upon death. They became the first members of the Sangha, the community of monks. The Buddha soon attracted more disciples, sometimes converting other teachers along with their followers. As a result, his fame began to spread. When the Buddha's father heard that his son had not died following his great renunciation but had become a Buddha, the king sent 9 successive delegations to his son to invite him to return home to Kapilavastu. But instead of conveying the invitation, they joined the disciples of the Buddha and became arhats. The Buddha was persuaded by the 10th courier, who also became an arhat, to return to the city, where he was greeted with disrespect by clan elders. The Buddha, therefore, rose into the air, and fire and water issued simultaneously from his body. This act caused his relatives to respond with reverence. Because they did not know that they should invite him for the noon meal, the Buddha went begging from door to door instead of going to his father's palace. This caused his father great chagrin, but the Buddha explained that this was the practice of the Buddhas of the past. His wife Yashodhara had remained faithful to him in his absence. She would not go out to greet him when he returned to the palace, however, saying that the Buddha should come to her in recognition of her virtue. The Buddha did so, and, in a scene often recounted, she bowed before him and placed her head on his feet. She eventually entered the order of nuns and became an arhat. She sent their young son Rahula to his father to ask for his patrimony, and the Buddha responded by having him ordained as a monk. This dismayed the Buddha's father, and he explained to the Buddha the great pain that he had felt when the young prince had renounced the world. He asked, therefore, that in the future a son be ordained only with the permission of his parents. The Buddha made this one of the rules of the monastic order. The Buddha spent the 45 years after his enlightenment traveling with a group of disciples across northeastern India, teaching the Dharma to those who would listen, occasionally debating with, and, according to the Buddhist sources, always defeating, masters from other sects, and gaining followers from all social classes. To some he taught the practice of refuge, to some he taught the 5 precepts, not to kill humans, steal, engage in sexual misconduct, lie, or use intoxicants, and to some he taught the practice of meditation. The majority of the Buddha's followers did not renounce the world, however, and remained in lay life. Those who decided to go forth from the household and become his disciples joined the Sangha, the community of monks. At the request of his widowed stepmother, Mahaprajapati, and women whose husbands had become monks, the Buddha also established an order of nuns. The monks were sent out to teach the Dharma for the benefit of gods and humans. The Buddha did the same. Each day and night he surveyed the world with his omniscient eye to locate those that he might benefit, often traveling to them by means of his supernormal powers. It is said that in the early years the Buddha and his monks wandered during all seasons, but eventually they adopted the practice of remaining in one place during the rainy season, in northern India, mid-July to mid-October. Patrons built shelters for their use, and the end of the rainy season came to mark a special occasion for making offerings of food and provisions, especially cloth for robes, to monks. These shelters evolved into monasteries that were inhabited throughout the year. The monastery of Jetavana in the city of Shravasti, Savatthi, where the Buddha spent much of his time and delivered many of the discourses, was donated to the Buddha by the wealthy banker Anathapindata, Pali, Anathapindika. The Buddha's authority, even among his followers, did not go unchallenged. A dispute arose over the degree of asceticism required of monks. The Buddha's cousin, Devadatta, led a faction that favored more rigorous discipline than that counseled by the Buddha, requiring, for example, that monks live in the open and never eat meat. When the Buddha refused to name Devadatta as his successor, Devadatta attempted to kill him 3 times. He first hired assassins to eliminate the Buddha. Devadatta later rolled a boulder down upon him, but the rock only grazed the Buddha's toe. He also sent a wild elephant to trample him, but the elephant stopped in his charge and bowed at the Buddha's feet. Another schism arose between monks of a monastery over a minor infraction of lavatory etiquette. Unable to settle the dispute, the Buddha retired to the forest to live with elephants for an entire rainy season. The death of the Buddha. Shortly before his death, the Buddha remarked to his attendant Ananda on 3 separate occasions that a Buddha can, if requested, extend his lifespan for an eon. Mara then appeared and reminded the Buddha of his promise to him, made shortly after his enlightenment, to pass into nirvana when his teaching was complete. The Buddha agreed to pass away 3 months hence, at which point the earth quaked. When Ananda asked the reason for the tremor, the Buddha told him that there are 8 occasions for an earthquake, one of which was when a Buddha relinquishes the will to live. Ananda begged him not to do so, but the Buddha explained that the time for such requests had passed. Had he asked earlier, the Buddha would have consented. At age 80 the Buddha, weak from old age and illness, accepted a meal. It is difficult to identify from the texts what the meal consisted of, but many scholars believe it was pork, from a smith named Chunda, instructing the smith to serve him alone and bury the rest of the meal without offering it to the other monks. The Buddha became severely ill shortly thereafter, and at a place called Kusinara, also spelled Kushinagar, modern Kasha, lay down on his right side between 2 trees, which immediately blossomed out of season. He instructed the monk who was fanning him to step to one side, explaining that he was blocking the view of the deities who had assembled to witness his passing. After he provided instructions for his funeral, He said that lay people should make pilgrimages to the place of his birth, the place of his enlightenment, the place of his first teaching, and the place of his passage into nirvana. Those who venerate shrines erected at these places will be reborn as gods. The Buddha then explained to the monks that after he was gone, the Dharma and the Vinaya, code of monastic conduct, should be their teacher. He also gave permission to the monks to abolish the minor precepts. Because Ananda failed to ask which ones, it was later decided not to do so. Finally, the Buddha asked the 500 disciples who had assembled whether they had any last question or doubt. When they remained silent, he asked 2 more times and then declared that none of them had any doubt or confusion and were destined to achieve nirvana. According to one account, he then opened his robe and instructed the monks to behold the body of a Buddha, which appears in the world so rarely. Finally, he declared that all conditioned things are transient and exhorted the monks to strive with diligence. These were his last words. The Buddha then entered into meditative absorption, passing from the lowest level to the highest, then from the highest to the lowest, before entering the 4th level of concentration, whence he passed into nirvana. The Buddha had instructed his followers to cremate his body as the body of a universal monarch would be cremated, and then to distribute the relics among various groups of his lay followers, who were to enshrine them in hemispherical reliquaries called stupas. His body lay in a coffin for 7 days before being placed on a funeral pyre and was set ablaze by the Buddha's chief disciple, Mahakashyapa, who had been absent at the time of the Buddha's death. After the Buddha's cremation, his relics were entrusted to a group of lay disciples, but armed men arrived from 7 other regions and demanded the relics. In order to avert bloodshed, a monk divided the relics into 8 portions. According to tradition, 10 sets of relics were enshrined, 8 from portions of the Buddha's remains, 1 from the pyre's ashes, and 1 from the bucket used to divide the remains. The relics were subsequently collected and enshrined in a single stupa. More than a century later, King Ashoka is said to have redistributed the relics in 84,000 stupas. The stupa would become a reference point denoting the Buddha's presence in the landscape of Asia. Early texts and the archaeological record link stupa worship with the Buddha's life and the key sites in his career. 8 shrines are typically recommended for pilgrimage and veneration. They are located at the place of his birth, his enlightenment, his first turning of the wheel of dharma, and his death, as well as sites in 4 cities where he performed miracles. A stupa in Samkashya, for example, marked the site where the Buddha descended to the world after teaching the Dharma to his mother, who died 7 days after his birth, abiding in the heaven of the 33 gods. The importance given to the stupa suggests the persistence of the Buddha in the world despite his apparent passage into nirvana. 2 types of nirvana are commonly described. The first is called the nirvana with remainder, which the Buddha achieved under the Bo tree, when he destroyed all the seeds for future rebirth. This first nirvana is therefore also called the final nirvana, or passing away, of the afflictions. But the karma that had created his present life was still functioning and would do so until his death. Thus, his mind and body during the rest of his life were what was left over, the remainder, after he realized nirvana. The second type of nirvana occurred at his death and is called the final nirvana of the aggregates, skanda, of mind and body, or the nirvana without remainder, because nothing remained to be reborn after his death. Something, in fact, did remain, the relics found in the ashes of the funeral pyre. A third nirvana, therefore, is sometimes mentioned. According to Buddhist belief, there will come a time in the far distant future when the teachings of Shakyamuni Buddha will disappear from the world and the relics will no longer be honored. It is then that the relics that have been enshrined in stupas around the world will break out of their reliquaries and magically return to Bodh Gaya, where they will assemble into the resplendent body of the Buddha, seated in the lotus posture under the Bodh tree, emitting rays of light that illuminate 10,000 worlds. They will be worshipped by the gods one last time and then will burst into flame and disappear into the sky. This third nirvana is called the final nirvana of the relics. Until that time, the relics of the Buddha are to be regarded as his living presence, infused with all of his marvelous qualities. Epigraphic and literary evidence from India suggests that the Buddha, in the form of his stupas, not only was a bestower of blessings, but was regarded as a legal person and an owner of property. The relics of the Buddha were, essentially, the Buddha. Images of the Buddha. The Buddha also remains in the world in the form of the texts that contain his words and statues that depict his form. There is no historical evidence of images of the Buddha being made during his lifetime. Indeed, scholars of Indian art have long been intrigued by the absence of an image of the Buddha on a number of early stone carvings at Buddhist sites. The carvings depict scenes in which obeisance is being paid, for example, to the footprints of the Buddha. One scene, considered to depict the Buddha's departure from the palace, shows a riderless horse. Such works have led to the theory that early Buddhism prohibited depiction of the Buddha in bodily form but allowed representation by certain symbols. The theory is based in part on the lack of any instructions for depicting the Buddha in early texts. This view has been challenged by those who suggest instead that the carvings are not depictions of events from the life of the Buddha but rather represent pilgrimages to and worship of important sites from the life of the Buddha, such as the Bo tree. Consecrated images of the Buddha are central to Buddhist practice, and there are many tales of their miraculous powers. A number of famous images, such as the statue of Mahamuni in Mandalay, Myanmar, derive their sanctity from the belief that the Buddha posed for them. The consecration of an image of the Buddha often requires elaborate rituals in which the Buddha is asked to enter the image or the story of the Buddha's life is told in its presence. Epigraphic evidence from the 4th or 5th century indicates that Indian monasteries usually had a room called the perfumed chamber that housed an image of the Buddha and was regarded as the Buddha's residence, with its own contingent of monks. The Mahayana tradition and the reconception of the Buddha. Some 4 centuries after the Buddha's death, movements arose in India, many of them centered on newly written texts, such as the Lotus Sutra, or new genres of texts, such as the Prajnaparamita or Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, that purported to be the word of the Buddha. These movements would come to be designated by their adherents as the Mahayana, the great vehicle to enlightenment, in contradistinction to the earlier Buddhist schools that did not accept the new sutras as authoritative, that is, as the word of the Buddha. The Mahayana Sutras offer different conceptions of the Buddha. It is not that the Mahayana schools saw the Buddha as a magical being whereas non-Mahayana schools did not. Accounts of the Buddha's wondrous powers abound throughout the literature. For example, the Buddha is said to have hesitated before deciding to teach after his enlightenment and only decides to do so after being implored by Brahma. In a Mahayana Sutra, however, the Buddha has no indecision at all, but rather pretends to be swayed by Brahma's request in order that all those who worship Brahma will take refuge in the Buddha. Elsewhere, it was explained that when the Buddha would complain of a headache or a backache, he did so only to convert others to the Dharma. Because his body was not made of flesh and blood, it was in fact impossible for him to experience pain. One of the most important Mahayana sutras for a new conception of the Buddha is the Lotus Sutra, Saddharmapundarika Sutra, in which the Buddha denies that he left the royal palace in search of freedom from suffering and that he found that freedom 6 years later while meditating under a tree. He explains instead that he achieved enlightenment innumerable billions of eons ago and has been preaching the Dharma in this world and simultaneously in myriad other worlds ever since. Because his lifespan is inconceivable to those of little intelligence, he has resorted to the use of skillful methods, upuya, pretending to renounce his princely life, practice austerities, and attain unsurpassed enlightenment. In fact, he was enlightened all the while yet feigned these deeds to inspire the world. Moreover, because he recognizes that his continued presence in the world might cause those of little virtue to become complacent about putting his teachings into practice, he declares that he is soon to pass into nirvana. But this also is not true, because his lifespan will not be exhausted for many more billions of eons. He tells the story of a physician who returns home to find his children ill from having taken poison during his absence. He prescribes a cure, but only some take it. He therefore leaves home again and spreads the rumor that he has died. Those children who had not taken the antidote then do so out of deference to their departed father and are cured. The father then returns. In the same way, the Buddha pretends to enter nirvana to create a sense of urgency in his disciples even though his lifespan is limitless. Such a view of the identity of the Buddha is codified in the doctrine of the 3 bodies, trikaya, of the Buddha. Early scholastics speak of the Buddha as having a physical body and a second body, called a mind-made body, or an emanation body, in which he performs miraculous feats such as visiting his departed mother in the heaven of the 33 gods and teaching her the Dharma. The question also was raised as to whom precisely the Buddhist should pay homage when honoring the Buddha. A term, dharmakaya, was coined to describe a more metaphorical body, a body or collection of all the Buddha's good qualities or dharmas, such as his wisdom, his compassion, his fortitude, his patience. This corpus of qualities was identified as the body of the Buddha to which one should turn for refuge. All of this is recast in the Mahayana Sutras. The emanation body, nirmanakaya, is no longer the body that the Buddha employs to perform supernatural feats. It is rather the only body to appear in this world and the only body visible to ordinary humans. It is the Buddha's emanation body that was born as a prince, achieved enlightenment, and taught the Dharma to the world. That is, the visible Buddha as a magical display. The true Buddha, the source of the emanations, was the dharmakaya, a term that still refers to the Buddha's transcendent qualities but, playing on the multivalence of the term dharma, came to mean something more cosmic, an eternal principle of enlightenment and ultimate truth, described in later Mahayana treatises as the Buddha's omniscient mind and its profound nature of emptiness. The presence of multiple universes. Along with additional bodies of the Buddha, the Mahayana Sutras also revealed the presence of multiple universes, each with its own Buddha. These universes, called Buddha fields or pure lands, are described as abodes of extravagant splendor, where the trees bear a fruit of jewels, the birds sing verses of the Dharma, and the inhabitants devote themselves to its practice. The Buddha fields became preferred places for future rebirth. The Buddhas who presided there became objects of devotion, especially the Buddha of infinite light, Amitabha, and his western paradise called Sukhavati. In the Buddha fields, the Buddhas often appear in yet a third form, the enjoyment body, Sambhogakaya, which was the form of a youthful prince adorned with the 32 major marks and 80 minor marks of a Superman. The former include patterns of a wheel on the palms of his hands and the soles of his feet, elongated earlobes, a crown protrusion, usnisa, on the top of his head, a circle of hair, urna, between his brows, flat feet, and webbed fingers. Scholars have speculated that this last attribute derives not from a textual source but the inadequacies of early sculptors. The marvelous physical and mental qualities of the Buddha were codified in numerous litanies of praise and catalogued in poetry, often taking the form of a series of epithets. These epithets were commented upon in texts, inscribed on stupas, recited aloud in rituals, and contemplated in meditation. One of the more famous is, thus gone, worthy, fully and completely awakened, accomplished in knowledge and virtuous conduct, well gone, knower of worlds, unsurpassed guide for those who need restraint, teacher of gods and humans, awakened, fortunate.